I mean, I always love talking and thinking about this album, but it's always exciting to introduce somebody to something, and you do this with me all the time. Introduce somebody to something that you really means a lot to you, and just kind of see what their reactions are.
I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And we are two political science professors who are here today to talk about Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska. Of course, the kind of news hook is that Nebraska 82, the special expanded edition, has just been released, along with Deliver Me From Nowhere. That's the name of the movie, right?
Yes.
The movie starring Jeremy Allen White as Bruce Springsteen. But I think we also want to touch on Springsteen kind of more broadly. And we've got sort of an interesting difference in experience with Springsteen between us. We've got a kind of expert and novice vibe going on. I had never heard of Nebraska, literally had never heard of Nebraska until a couple of weeks ago, where you said, I mean, I've heard of the state, but not the album. Until a couple of weeks ago, where you said, you know, this is coming out, you should do a pod on it. So this is almost like a reacts to, or not first time listening. You know, I've listened a few times, but I still have very neophyte views on this album. Whereas you're a real sort of expert in Springsteen.
I first heard this album when I was 18 years old, which would have been still
1860,
still about a decade after it was actually released. But I have been listening to this album for the better part of 3 decades by this point. So it is going to be very interesting to kind of do our temperature checks, I think, on where we stand on the album.
Yeah, so I think what we want to do is to, you know, of course it's important to talk about the kind of box set as a box set and the extra stuff that's in there. But certainly from my standpoint, I'm so kind of new to and overwhelmed by the original album. The most of the thoughts I have are on that original album. But maybe we should actually just get into temperature check and just start there.
Yeah.
Do you want to? I mean, your temperature has been percolating for a long time on this topic.
I first heard this album. I bought it as a used cassette tape. So that gives a little bit of.
Did it have a case?
It had a case.
Okay. Because famously, I mean, this was in the movie. We should say before we go further, you didn't watch the movie because you don't like music biopics and all the rest of it. I did go and watch the movie on my own because I thought, what's the easiest way for me to understand the context and the mythos of this album is probably going to see a dramatization of what is supposed to be a fairly factual book.
Right.
And anyway, the big thing is Bruce and then the producer are kind of walking around with this tape that doesn't even have a case, and they present it to the record company and there's no case.
Yeah, Bruce famously carries it in the back of his jeans pocket for weeks on end, apparently. The version that I bought did have a case.
Okay.
But the thing that I most remember about that particular cassette tape is that, as would sometimes happen with cassette tapes, the little ribbon would come detached from the spool. And on this version of Nebraska, it would happen after the third song, Mansion on the Hill. So every time that Mansion on the Hill was over, I'd have to take the cassette out, fish it out of the player, get the pencil out, re-spool the tape, and put it back in again. And so it was a real commitment, right, in a lot of ways to get through this album. But I just remember those first several listens. It sounds much better now, right? They've been able to remaster it digitally to the best that they can get it. And it still sounds, I think, very spooky and kind of ethereal. But that first transfer that was onto cassette tape, it was rough. I mean, it really sounded like it was something that was recorded in the 1920s or early 1930s with the most rudimentary of recording equipment. And it had a kind of arresting vibe about it that was out of place with what I at that point knew about Springsteen, which was mostly the big radio hits from Born in the USA. But Nebraska was the set of songs that really got me going deep into the rabbit hole.
Oh, okay, so you experienced Nebraska you said a decade after its release. Yeah. So the order at which you came to it was you had an image of Springsteen which post-dates Nebraska. So you didn't experience it temporally from The River to to The River was the album before.
The River was the album before. Nebraska.
From The River to Nebraska as it would have been experienced in real time.
So Nebraska is really it's really the first Springsteen album that I listened to.
Yeah.
And as I say, it was sort of, it graded against the popular image that I had of Springsteen, which is not entirely incorrect, this kind of anthemic stadium rocker that he had become in the mid-1980s. But Nebraska convinced me that this was there was a lot of depth, and this was a serious musician.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you're 18 or 19 and you're kind of desperately trying to figure out how to make sense of young adulthood. And for me, we've talked about this before, music was kind of the essential thing that I was going to run across an album like Nebraska that was both inviting in a lot of ways, but also alienating and mysterious and difficult and requires some effort to get into and live with. Finding that text was really kind of eye-opening to me. And so I was enchanted with it almost from the beginning. And then I have continued right on since then. So I have been really excited about the release of this. As you say, I don't care about the biopic, and I'm very unlikely to watch it. But the new box set I have been really enchanted by, and not only because it contains the fabled Electric Nebraska recordings, which we might touch on at some point, but just because to me it's a document that stands, Nebraska, that stands alone in Springsteen's oeuvre as containing a set of songs that are, I think, without peer. Certainly in his songbook, and I think there's a case to be made that it's some of the very finest of American popular songwriting of the 20th century. So I'm always really excited to get back into it.
Yeah, there's one point I just wanted to pick you up on that you mentioned there, which sort of bothered me, which was the wisdom or the point of doing a remaster, right? Because the whole thing, before I started listening to it, I kind of looked into what it was and read about and everything. And the whole point of the original album is this DIY, home kind of lo-fi recording setup. And it's dramatized in the movie at one point that the thing they're recording into, the kind of end point that they're getting the songs down, there is a guy there helping him set the stuff up. And he says, Bruce, this tape recorder is kind of beat up. And Bruce says, like, yeah, we dropped it in a lake or say, so and then it just started working. And he's like, yeah, but it's running at the wrong speed.
Yeah.
And Bruce is like, sounds right to me. And that's it. So given the uniqueness of that and that it's all supposed to be, there's stuff on there that couldn't be fixed in post.
Yeah.
And Bruce was like, that's the point. What then is the wisdom of going through a digital remastery process?
I think the remaster is simply to clean up the little bits that could be cleaned up.
Okay.
My understanding is that because of the condition of the original tape, there's really not a whole lot that can be done with it. It can be made a bit louder. Maybe they can run it through some compression to kind of clean up a little bit. And maybe there's a little bit of separation on some of the very spare instrumentation that occurs on these songs that can be brought to the fore a little bit more. I'm okay with the remasters because the remasters, all they really feel like they're doing is boosting the volume a little bit.
Okay.
It doesn't feel like it has cleaned up to me any of the harsh edges or the bespoke edges of the original recording.
Which in some sense is this kind of glorious, it therefore occupies as a piece of physical media or a piece of media, this almost unique place in our contemporary culture in that it's something that cannot be enhanced by AI.
Right.
Right? Like I'm sure there's stuff you could do to change it, but it would be noticeable because it has such a place in the memory of people who've listened to it for a long time that using the tools that everyone uses on audio now, that we, believe it or not, use even on our own audio, it's just not possible to create the artificial simulacrum. You actually need to remain faithful to the physical object from the past, which is almost unique in contemporary audio culture.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's my understanding, is because the original recording was so rudimentary and because it deteriorated so much before it even left the original cassette tape.
Right.
It was quite the feat of engineering, apparently, to simply get it off of the original cassette tape and onto vinyl. So they weren't even able to move it, my understanding is, onto what then would have been industry standard, moving it onto reel-to-reel. And then from the reel-to-reel, having the vinyl cut. It had to go straight to the vinyl. And so that introduces a whole new set of impurities, right? So it's possible maybe to see the remaster as sort of maybe even more accurate to the original recording because it has removed the sort of whatever the impurities that occurred as a result of transferring it to vinyl.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, you get the sense of like archaeologists with this sort of ancient artifact that if you just like use the brush or the knife a little bit wrong, the whole thing would crumble.
and it sounds ancient.
Yes.
Right. The songs sound ancient, and they kind of, we'll maybe talk more about this when we get more into the songs, but to me, the songs sound like they've kind of floated in from nowhere, and then they're there for a while, and then they kind of disappear back into the ether.
Yeah.
And almost as though they're, you're kind of working through the old radio dial, trying to find a transmission, which is referenced a lot in these songs, trying to find a transmission. And it, for a couple of minutes, you've got a clarity, and then you lose the transmission and it goes away. And that there's a kind of timelessness in that way to these songs and to this recording, but there's a kind of ancient vibe to these things. And what amazes me is that after 43 years, I mean, in a lot of ways, these songs are highly contemporary to the moment in which they were written and produced. But listening back, as I have over the years, none of the songs feel dated to me. The topics don't feel dated. The descriptions of people don't feel dated. None of it feels anachronistic. It just feels ancient.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, those are my sort of temper checks. What is your temperature check? I mean, I know that you know the song Dancing in the Dark and Born in the USA. But what else? Did you know anything else?
Nothing.
Yeah.
And Springsteen is exactly, my image of Bruce Springsteen is exactly the kind of artist that I would avoid like the plague. As you know, I have this sort of tragically narrow scope of music that I will allow into my realm as being legitimate artists.
Don't be too hard on yourself. You're willing to listen to music that's both from Manchester and Liverpool.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Music in Manchester or Liverpool, across a huge range of human history encompassing at least sort of 10 years. That's in the 1980s and the 1990s. And anything outside of that, I've just not really, very rarely have engaged with. And of course there was an ethos, because I like kind of indie guitar music from Britain in the 80s and 90s. And the ethos surrounding that was anything that got too big. Yeah. Was just regarded as inherently sort of corporate and a sellout and overly produced. Hugely ironic given what Nebraska actually is. So I would have grouped, up until a couple of weeks ago, Bruce Springsteen in that quote unquote great pantheon of American artists, although the first one I can think of is Canadian. Like Celine Dion. Do you know what I mean? Like middle of the road and U2, although they're Irish. I haven't actually come up with with another American artist. Taylor Swift. Things that I would inherently be suspicious of because they're too big. And so that's the image I had going in, and you're expecting kind of synthy, Born in the USA kind of stadium anthems. And of course it's nothing like that. So that kind of hits you like a train. The other thing I was expecting, because I started looking into Nebraska when you said you wanted to talk about it, and you're told it's this very dark, difficult, lo-fi, stripped down album, is I'm expecting an album of sludge and of non-melodic sludge. Yeah. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, the most striking thing to me is how melodic these songs are, and the melodies of almost every song are kind of in my head. Like I feel like I could reproduce, if you named the song off the album, can't remember all the words, but I can remember the melody, which is the sign of, which you would much more associate with someone like Taylor Swift, who's trying to write like pop bangers with every song. Right. And so that I thought was really interesting. And so I really liked that. I really obviously liked it. The depth of the lyrics. A win for me, of course, with Nebraska is, I was of course aware of the Terrence Malick film, and I rewatched that in preparation. Even before I listened even before I listened to Nebraska, I rewatched the film, which I think was smart. Yeah. Because that's what Springsteen did when he wrote the damn thing. Yeah. And then the final thing I'll say by way of preamble is, one thing that happens when you have a very narrow musical education like me is you encounter the echoes of something, and the people who are deeply influenced by it, and you assume that they're originals, or you don't quite fully understand how they've themselves integrated influences. And as you know, I like Craig Finn a lot, and I like the Hold Steady. And so I'm listening to something like Atlantic City, and I'm like, in topic and in storytelling and even in phrasing, this sounds like a Craig Finn song to me. And of course, so you Google it and it got Craig Finn, massive Springsteen fan, So that's another thing that, so you get the echo, which is Craig Finn. And he has other influences, of course, but and it's very useful to be shown by an older, wiser thing, you know, old Ben Kenobi to a Luke Skywalker.
Emphasis on older.
Well, I said wiser as well. To be educated a little bit in what might lie in the background of some things that I was previously familiar with.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I came into it.
Yeah. I mean, I think let's spend some time talking about the kind of the national context in which this album appears, because it is, on one hand, it's an intensely small album. These songs are deeply detailed, right? And almost every single song, if not every single one of them, hangs its narrative on a particular protagonist, or maybe a couple of protagonists, living very unique and particular specific lives. But it's one of the, I think, the lasting emphases of this album is that it is in a certain way a product of its time, right? It is an album that is written in 1981-ish, appears in 1982. This is the first couple of years of the Ronald Reagan administration. It marks really the sort of the historic and symbolic end, or the beginning of the end maybe, of the kind of post-war New Deal coalition in American politics. It hits at a time in which you've got the United States in significant conditions of economic peril. This is still the era of stagflation, right? And this is an album that is full of socially and economically isolated and precarious individuals. And it is accurate to the national context in which it was produced. This is also an album that appears, and we get some references here, not only in the songs that did make Nebraska, but in the sort of raft of other songs that he wrote famously as a part of the Nebraska, not even to call them sessions, but the Nebraska writing period. We also have lots of references, or at least occasional references, to the condition of the United States in the post-Vietnam era, and in particular, the condition of Vietnam veterans, right, who have come back. We see it most obviously in the Nebraska album in the song Highway Patrolman, which is the song about the two brothers, right? The sheriff and his sort of wayward brother who has done a stint in Vietnam. But it's also, of course, this is the story of Born in the USA itself, which is a song that was originally written as a part of this. There are other songs from this era as well that are very clearly sort of post-Vietnam era songs. Springsteen is writing these at the same time that Sylvester Stallone is doing First Blood.
So I thought about this. I don't mean to interrupt your flow, but I literally saw a video about this morning, and I really thought of this analog between Nebraska and First Blood. Yeah. Because the video was all about how First Blood, when it was shot, Stallone hated it at the end of it and thought, this is such an awful movie. Let's just burn it. And what had happened was they'd shot way more than they needed for the movie, and there was way more of like the fighting and the rah and the kind of combat type stuff. And Stallone said, well, what if we actually cut out almost all of my dialogue, and we, in the cut, make it this movie about this wounded Vietnam vet who's unable to reintegrate into an America that's now a stranger to him, and is this kind of outsider. And I thought that's a very like Nebraska thing. But the other parallel that occurred to me is that in both cases, the way that you present the material has really made the message there, right? Like there's a cut of First Blood that is like the later Rambo movies, that's all testosterone, steroids, and patriotism. But the actual thing that emerged is this kind of lo-fi, sad story of an outsider. And, there's a way to present Nebraska, and that's kind of the point of the box set. That's loud and bombastic and kind of the outside, my earlier impression of Springsteen. And then there's what actually was presented, and it's all in those decisions that were made that are essentially editing decisions or presentational decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, right? And it points to the ways that so much of what articulates in popular culture and with audiences is a product of conscious choices behind the scenes that nobody ever really sees except for the people who are doing the producing. And sometimes those people are in control of their choices and are working intentionally, and sometimes they're not, right? And one of the really interesting things about the box set of Nebraska that has just come out, as I said, that this idea that there were these electric full band recordings of these songs has been a mythic kind of elephant in the Springsteen fan community for decades and decades. And some of them appear here. It turns out that they did exist, and Springsteen himself didn't even remember cutting them.
Because he denied they existed, right?
He denied they existed, I think not because he was being coy, but because he just, they ran through half a dozen of the songs. He wasn't happy with what they were getting, and so they moved on.
Yeah.
And just kind of forgot about it. And one of the interesting things about this box set is that it actually elevates the original album in a way that sometimes these box sets don't, right? The box sets that are meant to kind of fill out a period or offer alternate takes or B-sides, and sometimes you listen to these box sets and you're like, the album should have been, right, this collection of songs interwoven with what actually was put out. But in the case of Nebraska, all of the choices ended up being completely correct. There's nothing on that box set that should have been on the original album. So that's a really kind of an interesting thing. And in the same way that I suspect that were we to watch the full cut of First Blood, we would come away with saying, no, they got it exactly right in the theatrical cut, right? Nothing here. It's all fine, right? And some of it's even sort of intriguing, but none of it would have made the original better.
Right.
And so that's a kind of again, it just sort of illustrates to me like a lot of the art of making the pop culture product takes place out of sight. And it's intentional choices, or sometimes it's happenstance that just works out. And I think that's what's happening here.
Right.
So this is the kind of the national context, right? The other thing that's happening is that we're, because of the kind of the coming to power of Reagan and that kind of older commitment to Cold War era rivalry politics with the Soviet Union, we're also starting to, the period of détente, so to speak, is starting to dissolve, right? And the early 1980s in the United States, and I think probably in the UK as well, is increasingly a time of Cold War tensions and anxieties pushing in a direction that sort of points to what we were just talking about in our last pod, the sort of the potential of nuclear apocalypse. Mm-hmm. That is also starting to happen. In the U.S., there's this infamous TV movie called The Day After that gets shown in early 1983. So again, right around the same time, that depicts the United States in the aftermath of nuclear apocalypse. TV movies these days don't even exist, but that movie hit like a ton of bricks, so to speak, on the national psyche. So there's a lot of these kinds of cascading, almost layer cake sorts of anxieties and tensions that are beginning to course through national life that are in many ways captured, I think, in Nebraska, and then played on the smallest, most local of scales, right, in each of these songs and in each of these narratives.
Well, and Bruce himself is in a period of deep anxiety or depression, exhaustion.
Yep.
He's come off, and this comes from the movie. You can tell me if it's wrong or not, but he's come off this kind of exhausting but highly successful tour, which is, physically and mentally exhausting because he has this kind of ambivalent relationship with his success, and maybe this kind of guilt or repressed guilt about the success. He says at one point in the movie, I don't know if it's apocryphal or it really happened, but he goes to buy a car, ironically, because see there is a song on here about buying cars. And the salesman says at some point in the negotiations, it's a great car for a good-looking rock star, and I do know who you are, by the way. And Bruce says, well, that makes at least one of us. He's in this period of kind of identity crisis, I suppose. And so all those national anxieties are also mirrored by, channeled through, contributing to a period of high anxiety.
Yeah, and he's coming,
the artist himself.
He's coming off of this period of concert performances, which even at the time were recognized and seen as historically impressive and important. The sheer caliber of the musicianship from the band at this point is at the top of the scales. The shows are getting longer and longer and longer. And what had started off in the previous tour for Darkness on the Edge of Town as a tour, as a show that would approach 3 hours, but which would have an intermission in there as well, have now become like 4-hour shows with no intermission. And these shows have become these feats of kind of almost athletic endurance. And they take on this kind of mythic status amongst the audience, amongst rock critics. But it comes out that, a lot of this is Springsteen is exhausting himself. He comes later to recognize he's physically exhausting himself because that will force him to just be able to sleep.
He said in one of the interviews I saw, I think it was an interview looking way back on the period, so a contemporary interview, says the 3 hours on stage I'm good with. It's the other 21 that I'm struggling with.
Right. Which is not an uncommon, I think, position for a lot of performers who find themselves, and I think notoriously one of the reasons why touring is so difficult for so many musicians in particular is because the reason they're doing it is for those 90 minutes or 3 hours. But to do that is excruciating. And what do you do with yourself the rest of, when the only place that you feel comfortable is on that stage and performing in front of people, which is very much Springsteen at this point in his life, what do you do with yourself for the rest of the time? And, for a lot of touring musicians, it's drugs and alcohol or other kinds of destructive behavior because they don't have a kind of capacity to deal in a functional way with the exact thing that is pushing them out there onto the stage to perform like these kind of high wire acts, every night in front of rooms or stadiums full of strangers. So all of that seems to be coming to a head in Springsteen's personal life at this point. And the other thing that's coming to a head is a lot of his repressed childhood traumas, particularly around his relationship with his parents and especially his relationship with his father. And so multiples of these songs, right, are dealing with that as well. And the other thing that's happening that we'll get to after the break, by means of introduction to the album itself, is that Springsteen has been undergoing this kind of political consciousness raising, and it's beginning to infuse itself very clearly into his songwriting.
Okay. All right. So we'll pick up on that after this very quick break. And we are back with our discussion of Bruce Springsteen and Nebraska. And we were talking about Bruce's sort of awakening political consciousness.
Yeah. So one of the things that's happening in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and a lot of this does have to do with the influence of his manager, John Landau, who I understand has a starring role. His character has a starring role in the biopic.
Yes, Jeremy Strong. Played by
Jeremy Strong.
Yeah.
And it's a close relationship that develops between Landau and Springsteen beginning in the mid-1970s on the Born to Run tour, just before the Born to Run tour. And, Landau has a kind of, he's a music critic by trade. And so he's a writer and he's a bit of a thinker, and he kind of operates in this slightly intellectual realm, which was becoming more and more prominent for music critics of the day. So this is the time he's a contemporary with somebody like Robert Christgau of The Village Voice, or with Greil Marcus, who's written a ton of books as sort of from the position of cultural critic via music. It's the onset of Rolling Stone, the publication Rolling Stone, right, which first finds its way into the mainstream via this kind of music and cultural criticism. And
it's like that kid from Almost Famous. Have you seen that movie?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, Lester Bangs, Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Exactly, right. It's all of these figures who they all kind of running in the same circles. And so Landau brings to Springsteen, who's just a working class, he's grown up very working class in Freehold, New Jersey, just outside of Asbury Park, not that far from Atlantic City. And Springsteen has, his education to this point has been rock and roll, right? That has been the thing that has gotten him outside of himself and outside of his own life. And so he has dug into that influence as hard as humanly possible, right? And so when you go back and you listen, for example, to Born to Run, the themes of isolation and alienation and sort of precarity or marginality, they exist on that album as well. And they definitely exist on the next album, Darkness on the Edge of Town. But they exist within the register of rock and roll. They exist within the register of popular culture specifically, and popular music of the previous 25 or 30 years in particular. And Springsteen doesn't have any kind of formal education. He doesn't have any kind of meaningful artistic education outside of that realm. And so one of the things that Landau is introducing him to is Springsteen is getting more and more curious and starting to realize that rock and roll can only take you so far if you want to really dig as deep as possible into the lives of your characters and really into his own sort of dysfunctional past. That rock and roll can only go so far, he thinks. And so one of the first things that Landau introduces him to is country music, old country music in particular, which, so artists like the Carter Family and Johnny Cash, and especially Hank Williams, who Springsteen really spends a lot of time doing a deep dive on. And Springsteen concludes that this is where adult people, in popular music, this is where adult people go to talk about adult things. Not just the flush of love and hate and
oh baby yeah
and being horny all the time,
right.
Which is sort of early rock and roll in particular has a kind of a lock hold, right, on these themes. So but in country music you talk about other things, right? You talk about adult things. And so he finds Springsteen does a real kind of fountain spring of inspiration in early country music. But the other thing that Landau starts to do is he picks up on Springsteen's love of movies. And Springsteen loves film noir, right? And Landau says, you need to watch some of these other movies, right? And this is mid to late 1970s, early to mid late 1970s in American cinema is the silver age of American directors. So famously Terrence Malick for Springsteen, but also Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola and Woody Allen, later George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. It's the rise in Hollywood of the director-centered system, right? And so producers are starting to lose their hold in big, like Warner Brothers.
Like auteur cinema.
Yeah, it's auteur cinema. It really gets its start. I mean, arguably the start has been Orson Welles and Hitchcock earlier, but it really takes off in American cinema in the 1970s. Yeah. And they're starting to produce these kinds of movies that are difficult movies, right? That are, the narratives are told in various ways. They are fractured. They tend to be movies that have big themes. And they're really these kinds of Vietnam era and then post-Vietnam era reconciliations with the long-standing and occasionally dysfunctional big picture themes of the American community. And so there's a lot to work through in these movies. And, the movie that Landau introduces Springsteen to that really catches his attention is Badlands.
So here's an interesting point that the movie version of this in Deliver Me From Nowhere is Springsteen's in the, what's it called? Colt's Neck. Rendell.
Rented house.
Watching TV one night and he happens to stumble across Badlands halfway through. All right, there's a and you're going to have to clear this up for me historically. There's a problem with that, which is he has a song on an earlier album called Badlands.
Yes.
And in the story you've just told me, it's actually John Landau purposefully introduces him to that movie. It's not just a serendipitous thing that he stumbles across.
I think that the timeline is a little hazy on this. So the movie may well be correct. And Springsteen may well not remember.
Sure.
But the earlier song Badlands is from the 1978 album Darkness on the Edge of Town.
But is that about the movie?
It is not.
Okay.
It isn't.
So it could just be a naming
It's a naming convention. It's a song that is...
Or you might have heard of the movie but not seen
almost
it.
Certainly. And of course, I mean, Badlands is a reference to Badlands National Park in South Dakota. And that's the other thing that's happening here. And we'll get it when we get into the songs in just a minute, right? I think there's a purposeful slippage when he's telling the murderous story of Charlie Starkweather and Carla Fugate in the song Nebraska. I think there's purposeful slippage here because, our narrator says through the Badlands of Wyoming. Well, the Badlands are in South Dakota.
Yeah.
But Starkweather, it's totally plausible that he wouldn't have known.
Yes.
Right. Where he was or where they were. Right. You're somewhere out in the plains and it's all kind of the same anyway.
Yeah.
So Springsteen would have been aware of he would have heard the title. He would have been aware this is not something that would have been, totally unique to him. Yeah. But the Badlands itself it's Terrence Malick's directorial debut. It stars Martin Sheen and Sissy Spacek, excuse me, as the protagonists of what is a kind of a stylized retelling of an actual murder spree from a guy named Charlie Starkweather and Carla Fugate, Starkweather was 18 or 19, Fugate was 14 or 15. And it's a loose telling, but it's more accurate than not of the actual events. And Starkweather was this kind of James Dean-like rebel without a cause character, a kind of juvenile, or portrayed at least as just sort of the nightmare image of the juvenile delinquent, which in the 1950s United States was one of the real bête noirs of mainstream popular culture, people to be feared. And you can watch Rebel Without a Cause, and there are bits and pieces of that characterization that we see in James Dean's performance. That's how Terrence Malick really plays up the Kit character, the Martin Sheen character, Kit Carruthers in Badlands, is he puts him in the James Dean getup, right? And it's a story about, it tells the story in a certain way of that murder spree, but it tells it in a way that is very much intended to evoke the images of pastoral America, the kind of conventional Americana images, and then turn them inside of themselves and to explore the kind of the dark heart at the center of the American dream.
Right, and I think that's crucial in both Nebraska the song and Badlands the movie, that Starkweather's, I mean, he's a psychopath, but that's not really what's going on, right? He's more he's active in that he kills people, but he's almost a passive channeling a kind of latent, I don't know, evil, or, well, as Springsteen says in the song, there's a meanness in the world. And he's very like, oh shucks, this is just how it's gonna go, as he himself is authoring a murder spree.
And there's a certain way that this is kind of this is freedom unbound, right? It's an inversion and a kind of nightmare storytelling of the Horatio Alger charge to go west, young man, right? That's where they're heading, right? They're going west and west and west, which in fabled Americana is where you go to reinvent yourself. It's where you go to make a life. It's where you get yourself unhinged from existing social constraints and you make something of yourself, which is in many ways the promise of the American dream, so to speak. And what Malick is saying is what happens when you unhinge yourself from social constraints is that you enter into the land of murderers and psychopaths, people who are disconnected, isolated, and alienated. It's the exact land that the songs in Nebraska take place in.
Yeah, and it's very, I mean, it finds a later expression, I think, in like Cormac McCarthy. Like that's very much his philosophy, right? That there's just a free-floating sort of evil that finds its expression or manifestation in agents, but the agents are not, it's not really them necessarily. They're kind of inhabited by this, or they become the specific instantiation of just what is a general, a God that is indifferent to your fate and a general meanness of man.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, you think about, for example, No Country for Old Men.
Exactly.
Right. Which this is hitting all of that exactly. And the landscape is really important, right? In No Country for Old Men. And the landscape is super important in Badlands. And I think it's really important in Nebraska as well.
Yeah, and you could see why there's a flatness to Malick's, to Martin Sheen and even Sissy Spacek's kind of performance, and a sort of lack of affect that's very redolent of psychopathy, but also would be very appealing or recognizable to someone in the midst of a depressive episode. It's just seeing the world as non-vivid and as flat, and responding to it in an emotionally underwhelming way, while also taking quite extreme actions. In the case of the psychopath, in terms of harming other people. In the case of the depressive, either self-harm or just a lack of concern for self.
Yeah, that's really sharp, right? And it's these punctuated moments of activity or punctuated moments of vividness in an otherwise landscape of just kind of nothingness,
right?
Or being, as Springsteen says in multiple places, nowhere, right?
Right.
That this is the experience of being, in a depressive episode. One is nowhere.
Yeah.
Right. And these are characters who are nowhere, right? In a whole variety of different ways. And there's a certain way in which the songs from Nebraska reflect, in an almost transparent and one-to-one relationship, what Springsteen is watching, what he's thinking, how he's experiencing the world in these moments, even though a great many of the songs are not autobiographical.
Well, that's it. So it's often called Springsteen's most personal album, and yet it's told through third-party characters.
Right.
And there's a bit in the movie where he writes out the lyrics to Nebraska, and then he goes through and he changes he to I, him to me, all the way through to make it personal. So he's inhabiting the character, but he's still inhabiting a real life third party
Yeah.
character. So it's a really interesting way of telling a personal story through sort of taking possession of the bodies and lives of others.
And it allows for a lot of creative license as well.
Sure.
Right. And it allows, I imagine it would allow him to feel like he could explore things through characters that he was not willing to assign to his own experiences.
Right, absolutely. The last thing I wanted to say on Nebraska is and it's a comparison between the original and Electric Nebraska, like that kind of opening burst of harmonica is so kind of iconic and so perfectly sets the tone for what is to come, and is so sort of arresting and overwhelming on the original. And I think that one reason for not, there's plenty of reasons, but one reason for not having released Electric Nebraska is it kind of muddies that, and that dulls it, and it's really important that be the thing you hear, and it be that sort of overwhelming and memorable, and it really gets you right in there.
Yeah, and atonal.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, it's a great point. I hadn't.
What's also that howl of
harsh
despair, or
yeah, it's a great point. I mean, because the harmonica plays a significant role. It's not uncommon for Springsteen to play harmonica, even on sort of the more obvious rock songs, but it never plays such a prominent role musically. And now that you say that, I think probably thematically as well as it does on these songs. That's the instrument that's needed, along with the kind of the glockenspiel, which occurs in the background of a great many of these songs, with the kind of the strange, almost carnival-like sounds that get introduced into what appears to otherwise to be a set of scenarios that wouldn't have any place for that sort of whimsical sonic attitude. But on the sonics, right? Let's talk a little bit about the sonics themselves. We sort of alluded to this earlier. Like, to me, the songs sound ancient. And it's the recording. They're spooky, right? A lot of these songs, I mean, think about like State Trooper, for example, which kicks off the second side, what would have been originally the second side of the album. I mean, that's a harrowing song.
Please don't stop. I mean,
right? Yeah, it's a harrowing song.
Right.
And I don't know how you recapture that sense of desperation. In a studio with other musicians.
Right. And as he's howling in the yes, okay, all right. So what's going on there? He's asking, he's saying, please don't stop me because I'm going to kill you if you do.
If you stop me.
Okay,
right?
But he hasn't actually killed the person. It's just he's driving, because of course it has that driving.
Yeah, right. He asks. He's thinking to himself, maybe you have a child, maybe you have a pretty wife.
Right.
Like, the only thing that I have has been bothering me my whole life. And this is the first place where the line "deliver me from nowhere" occurs.
Yeah.
Well, what is the mode of deliverance here? I mean, he's sort of asking, on one hand, he's pleading with the State Trooper not to stop him because I'll kill you if you do.
Right.
On the other hand, that will be the mode of deliverance. That,
like suicide by
that violence, right, will be the moment of punctuation, the vivid moment of punctuation in an otherwise desperate and drab, isolated existence.
Yes.
"Deliver me from nowhere" is a line that appears again in the next song, or 2 songs later, "Open All Night." And there it's very different. It's pitched very differently. There, the line is, so in State Trooper, it's "Hey Ho Silvero, deliver me from nowhere." So that's "Hey Ho Silvero" is a reference, I think, to the Lone Ranger. Right? It's kind of the tagline of the Lone Ranger, which makes sense when you're talking about, a character who is isolated, who is likely prone to violence, and sees violence as a method of deliverance. In "Open All Night," it's "Hey Ho Rock and Roll, deliver me from nowhere," right? So here we've got this kind of throwback to what we were talking about earlier, that you've got a character who's trying to push the bounds again of what's possible in the sort of community of rock and roll to help deliver this guy from the sense of isolation, right, that he's experiencing. It's just little things like that. Like, if it weren't a demo, if Nebraska weren't intended as a demo, he wouldn't have put the same lines in different songs. Right. And it occurs also in Johnny 99 and Atlantic City.
Right? What's that? Debts no honest man can pay. I've got debts that no honest man can pay. Right.
There's no way, right, if you were crafting a set of final songs that you would repeat those lines. Right. But the fact that they reappear just actually here provides significant continuity and coherence. And it makes it clear that we're dealing with an integrated sort of body of songs or an integrated text in a way that's, I think, pretty unique in popular music.
Yeah. There's also two, I mean, I wonder if of course it was deliberate, whatever, but there's two pairs of songs that have the same, there's Used Cars and Open All Night. That's both about cars.
Yeah.
And then there's Highway Patrolman and State Trooper that are both about cops, and they're both are back to back.
And told from different perspectives.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, Highway Patrolman is a devastating song.
Yeah.
Right? This is the story of Joe Roberts and his brother Frank. But it's a deeply melodic song. It's got one of the catchiest melodies and one of the catchiest choruses on the entire album. But it is this sort of micro storytelling that is masterful, and it ends, I think, in a surprising way. Right? You would expect the end to be this sort of violent confrontation between the brothers, a kind of Cain and Abel reincarnate, and instead what happens is that Joe just lets him go, right? And chooses the relations of blood over the duties of the community.
Yeah.
And so it's a kind of a devastating song, and it's a song that harkens back to at least the imagery of one of Springsteen's earlier songs from Darkness on the Edge of Town, which is called Adam Raised a Cain. So these are, not infrequently you'll see Springsteen delving in these kinds of biblical themes as well, or employing at least the outlines of Bible stories in order to bring to life contemporary moments or dramas, which is the same thing actually that Terrence Malick does in his second movie, Days of Heaven.
Yes.
Right? In which it took me, we were talking off camera some time ago, it took me quite some time to realize that is actually a story, the narrative that is very much a parable or set of consistent with a set of parables from the book of Genesis.
Yeah. I mean, the title did mention heaven.
Yes.
But I hadn't got that either. The other thing that occurred to me is that what's going on thematically a lot in the album is this, and you just alluded to it, this sort of individual morality, individual kind of, family ties and obligations and definitely guilt.
Yeah.
And then societal morality and societal obligations and the kind of clash between the two. So some of these lines, like "debts an honest man can pay," could definitely be Springsteen's character, or Springsteen through his character, talking about, debts I have to family, or guilt I have, personal guilt about success and personal unease and so forth. But also there's a commentary on the crooked nature of the American dream in the age of Reagan.
Yeah.
There's debts an honest man can pay because honest men can't succeed in this society. And it's really, those lines are working on two levels simultaneously.
Yeah. No, yeah, I agree. And it might even be working on the third level that you alluded to, was that it's the debt of the kind of crooked inheritance of the sort of what you inherit unwillingly and unwittingly from those who've come before you.
Yeah.
Right. And here you've got a generation or a group of very frustrated and desperate characters who have inherited conditions not of their own making, social and economic.
Right.
But you also have, individual characters who have inherited through blood, right, or other circumstance, conditions of life that were also not of their making.
So everything that dies someday comes back. Yeah. Is that what's going on there? What is that line about?
So
that's in Atlantic City.
Atlantic City. Yeah. It's the chorus of Atlantic City. I read that as a kind of I think it's a cruel line, and it's actually a desperate line in a way that, when you understand that so the reference here is to Atlantic City and the attempt of Atlantic City the factual attempt, its historical attempt to recreate itself from a dead and dying kind of, early 20th century resort town. Its attempt to reinvent itself essentially by getting in bed with the mob,
right,
and organized crime, and bringing in casinos
and building the boardwalk
and building out the boardwalk. Yeah. And the song begins with a reference to an actual mob hit. They blew up the Chicken Man in Philly last night. Chicken Man was a mob enforcer who got blown and I think it was the Gambino family, and he got blown up, and they blew up his house too, right? And then all the lyrics are about the crime and the dysfunction of what has happened in this city. Well, what had been promised? Atlantic City was dead. Everything that dies, maybe everything that dies someday comes back. This was the method of deliverance that was promised, right? And we're gonna bring it back with gambling. And so But actually, it's, and when you look at the narrator's story in Atlantic City, last night I met this guy and I'm going to do a little favor for him. And that's the last that we hear, but we know it's not going to go well.
Yeah,
we
yeah.
know the favor is illicit or illegal. And I mean, this is a guy who's finding himself now in bed essentially with organized crime of one sort or another. And it's not going to get better. Right?
Yeah.
It's going to get worse and worse and worse. Everything dies, maybe that's a fact, but maybe everything that dies someday comes back. Strikes me in that context not as hopeful, not as pointing necessarily to like sort of biblical terms of Jesus being resurrected on Easter morning, but rather like the kind of the hollowness of that sense of hope and optimism, right? Because in fact, it's dead. And when things are dead, they don't come back.
Yeah.
Right? That's the whole point. And we see this repeated again in My Father's House, which I think is one of Springsteen's very best songs, an incredible song. And it's a song of Springsteen dreaming that he has this moment of reconciliation with his father.
Right.
But it's dead.
Yeah.
Right? And here, so literally Springsteen's father was not dead at this time, but the possibility of a meaningful relationship is dead. It can't come back.
Yeah.
Right? It's not coming back. And so the final lines, right? We walk across this highway where our sins lie unatoned. There will be no possibility to atone.
Yeah.
Right? There is no deliverance. Right? And so when our narrators are asking to be delivered from nowhere, they're asking for something that's not possible.
Right.
I think those lines are actually even more devastating and despairing than they come off originally.
Yeah. So there's a bit in the movie that I now wonder if it's not true, where Springsteen's father sort of visits him in the dressing room and has him sit on his knee, and Springsteen's like, I'm 32 years old.
That is true.
Oh,
yeah. So it, and they eventually have some moments of reconciliation when his father is eventually accurately diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic.
Yeah.
And is then like gets actual meaningful treatment.
Right.
But that will happen much later.
Okay.
And it points to how do you ever repair, right? The early breaches, the early family breaches between people who are so deeply emotionally connected with one another. Right. How can you ever actually deal with that? Right? It would take extraordinary time and energy and personalities who are really committed to repairing those kinds of breaches to pull it off. And in a certain sense, it's dead, right? Right. And it's the reason why it's so, in so many ways, a devastating song and a devastating commentary is that, I mean, we have those experiences. We all have those experiences as children. Great many of us have those experiences as parents as well. And to reflect back on, you say, how did I behave, right, in these moments of kind of emotional peril, right? Did I behave in ways that have forever ruptured the possibility of meaningful relationships? And, we can talk about it in the future. You can try to work your way through it. But the odds of actually ever repairing such a fundamental breach of trust seem so long that what is much more likely to happen is, in fact, for the sins to lie unatoned.
Reason to Believe. There's the last song on the album. And it read at least on a surface level to me, and I haven't spent long enough to fully excavate it, but I want you to help me here, as a more hopeful note than sort of standing aside from the rest of the album a bit. I mean, am I getting the vibe right on that?
I think that's one that is definitely on the surface. I have tended to read that over the years as a kind of a statement of the absurdity of things, because through all the verses, it's just terrible things that are happening to people, right? They're
it's
dying,
like it's four stories, right? Like one in each verse. Yeah.
They're coming across, right? It begins, the first verse is, a man came across a dead dog lying in the middle of the road or on the side of the road. And so the thing is dead, but he keeps poking it with a stick, thinking that it's going to come back to life, right? Which goes back to the Atlantic City line.
Yeah.
Everything that dies, maybe everything that dies someday comes back. So, I mean, to me, and all of the fact scenarios that are presented there in the stories are you've got your protagonists in each of the little mini stories hoping for things, expecting things, holding on, clinging on to the possibility of things happening that couldn't possibly happen, right? And it's interspersed. Those three kind of micro stories are interspersed with the verse about the baptism of the baby and the death of an old man, right? This is the way that life works. Things die, and then they're dead, and other things are born. And it's absurd to poke the dead dog with a stick. It's insane. It's absurd and insane to stand there at the end of the road every day by the mailbox waiting for the person who left you years ago to come back. It's absurd and insane to be standing, having been stood up and clearly left isolated and alone at your wedding, to expect it to change. So I think even Reason to Believe, which I think you accurately detect it on the surface as being this kind of strangely hopeful song, right? Isn't it funny how at the end of the day, people still find some reason to believe at the end of every hard-earned day? I actually think it's more of a commentary on the absurdity of faith, the absurdity of, or not so much the absurdity of faith, but the absurdity of a kind of unverifiable optimism and hope, and the cruelty of it all. And that maybe we're led to believe that one of the enabling conditions for the social and economic and political and communal isolation and desperation that these characters feel is because of the way that they have been done wrong by faithless hope.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that brings us to the end of our kind of in-depth excavation of Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska. I want to say thank you for, being my guide to sort of broadening my horizons a little bit. I'm really glad we had the box set and the movie as kind of a reason to talk about this album, and I'm really glad to have encountered it. Yeah,
I mean, I always love talking and thinking about this album, but it's always exciting to introduce somebody to something, and you do this with me all the time. Introduce somebody to something that you really means a lot to you, and just kind of see what their reactions are.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So thank you for coming along with us. Share your thoughts, recollections maybe of Nebraska in the comments section, or if you're new to the album, let us know. Go and listen to it and let us know what you think. We always get a lot from the comments. We really do appreciate them. But on that bombshell,